Episode 12, believe it or not, 12. So last time we were working on our immediate mode GUI that we were building, and we had gotten to a point where we had some basic controls available. So we have a frame that we're drawing. Within the frame are these buttons. I can click on them and they're triggering these print statements. So they're discrete buttons. If I click on that button, it makes the whole frame disappear, but this button is separate, and you can click on that and make the whole frame reappear. So, we have some basic functionality working here. Pretty straightforward stuff. Over the weekend, I was thinking about what we were working on and debating, sort of taking a step back and looking at using something that just referenced OpenGL and had the UI built for us, and just after messing around with stuff, I felt like as much as this is a distraction from NES programming, on the assembler side. At least this is straightforward, and we're kind of working towards a pretty straightforward goal here, with the stuff related to how all of the programming for the OpenGL stuff works. It's I just feel like there's a lot of overhead involved in getting that all online and working, which makes it not ideal for what we're doing. Like, on the one hand, yeah, it's all built and relatively straightforward, and then we don't have to build these controls. But at the same time, kind of feel like there's maybe more benefit to doing this than to just plugging something into OpenGL and messing around with that. So what I'm hoping to do today is, like I said in my tweet, get something where we're able to have some basic functionality in here. It's going to be messy, but reference some content and do something where we can take it and put it into the game, just sort of as a starting point for the next stream where we start to build some more functionality. I just kind of want to create that linkage between this and that. We'll see how all of that goes. So part of what I want to do related to that is I want to kind of work on how we're going to handle file system structure. Again, I'm kind of hoping that this would be something that would be cross-platform, so I don't necessarily want to be doing a lot of code in this portion of it, which would be the actual application. That would be Windows specific, and I think we've actually managed to do that because we're using Tigger, whatever you call it, to handle the graphics, and then we've moved all of our UI code into a namespace that's specific for the GUI. And even that code is pretty generic. There's not a lot that's related to Windows. I think there may be a couple of Microsoft specific calls that we're making for the string manipulation, but nothing egregious. So what I was thinking we would want to do is create essentially a structure that defines the endpoints that we want to call, that are essentially callbacks, right? So functions that get called when something occurs in the environment that the application is running in. But these are going to be calls that are specific to the calls to accomplish that functionality are going to be specific to Windows or Mac OS or whatever operating system the application is running on. So I want that to sort of be isolated. I'd like for it to be something where our calls are pretty self-contained. Again, to minimize the intermingling of platform-specific code. So what do I mean by that? Let's start with a diagram. So what I mean by that is I want it to be so that here's our application, right? It's running on top of some operating system. There are hooks that we're going to call for things like files, file system changes, etc. Right? All of that stuff is Windows operating system specific. What I want to do is I want to just say, okay, I'm going to define these functions we're going to call if any of these things happen. So if a file changes, I want it to call this. If a folder changes, I want it to call this. So on the application side, it's independent. It doesn't really care how it got notified that that change occurred. It expects certain data to come back from the caller, and then we deal with it in our asset tool accordingly. So let's add a header to define the structure where those callbacks will live. So let's call this and call it asset tool hooks. Actually define, we'll forward define that system hooks exists somewhere. And that would, let's see, that would be actually instantiated in here. So we'll say that's the actual instance of it. Why don't you like my too many initializer values? Well, I guess, yeah, it doesn't have any structs in there, so. Okay, yeah, that's why it's complaining. All right, that's fine. So the first thing we want to do is we want to have a call that gets initiated let's see. We want a call that gets initiated when the application starts up and it gets a list of files. So let's see. How would that be defined? What would that look like? I want to cheat and look back at my GUI code for the function pointer stuff because I always forget what that looks like. Okay, so do something like we'll just call it current home. Right, so current home, it's what's going to get called to pass information about the home folder that the application is running in. And so I'm kind of debating if we want to use, like on the one hand, using something like the C++ standard lib vectors and stuff is super easy to do. but it's kind of overkill for what we'd be needing it for. We need a structure called something like file system item. And I forget what Windows max file or folder name length is. That's max path. Is it 255 characters technically? All right, well. And then let's see. So if his directory is true, then it's obviously it's a folder. Now I know we probably should be using a 64-bit unsigned here to represent file size, because technically it could, file can be that big, but at the same point we're dealing with NES stuff, so we shouldn't be dealing with anything that's nearly that big. So I'm not using unsigned char for up to 256 bytes because that would be too small, I think, but short, I don't know. I'm good with an int. It's not really a big deal. So we're going to get back a list of the current file system data that we are looking at. See, the thing with this is, like, we could pass it a vector and it would get the vector, and then we could, become essentially the owner of the vector, meaning the call or callback would then take over ownership of that vector, and we would have hooks. Because what I'm thinking we would want to do is the following, and we'd want to have a hook like current home, and then we'd have another one, file change with then folder change, right? And those would get called when files were added or deleted or updated. Same thing with the folders. We don't need to implement those now. I don't want to mess with that yet. I want to just start with, let's get a list of things that are in our current home folder. And even though we're going to do that, though, it could potentially change. I don't know. These are the decisions that you got to kind of balance out as you go, because you want to make sure that you're not having to rewrite a whole bunch of stuff later. I mean, I suppose I could make this a linked list of items that we could then manage pretty easily. Wouldn't be hard to do. But at the same point, do I want to really be dealing with linked lists? Or arrays that I could resize. We could do an array that we can resize. That's fine. I'm fine with that. So let's do this. We'll do file system item pointer, current home content, and then number of items. Right. So that's going to be explicit type is missing. Right, so when we get this, when we get called, we're going to get the current list of content in the home directory. It's going to be a flat list. We're not going to traverse subfolders right now. We'll see, we may change our minds on that, but just for the sake of simplicity now, it wouldn't be hard to change to make that possible, to add siblings to each item in the file system, but and then the number of items so that we can keep track of if we need to add to them, we can expand the size of this list. So ships or no's? No, I don't work for Nintendo. And the dog is the dog is crying because he just he had that operation that all puppies have to have at some point. So he's a little cranky. He'll be okay. All right. So getting back to this. We have that. Okay, so that looks good. So let's now add, we're going to add some new code here, and we're going to call this Win32. I'm pretty sure, is it Win32? I think that's right. I think that's the it's been a while since I've programmed in C++ and on Windows. Usually do C# for my day stuff, my day gig. All right, so if def win32. So this is going to be all our Windows code. So well, let's do this. Actually, yeah. Sorry. I was thinking about this backwards. So this is the call that's going to be made to load the content, and then it's going to call system hooks current home with the current content and number of items, right? So in Windows, you do find first. Find first file. So this is just a this is just the Windows call for getting the files that are in a particular folder, and you can specify a file filter. So let's go to MSDN for this for a second because I don't remember the syntax. All right, so it's just the name and then our find data structure. And if we look at this for a second, oh, they changed this. You gotta wrap it in. Is it text? What is this? argv is a tchar already. These annoying macros that Microsoft uses all over the place to make things just extra confusing. That. So basically what we're saying is we want to find all files, and that should, I believe, start in the current directory. We'll test that out just to just to verify. And we'll just create a empty pointer here so we can compile this and run it. Unsigned int number of items 0, and then we probably should check to make sure that if we're going to call this, that it's actually a valid pointer. Find first file, does it return? It returns the handle to an hfind. And then you just keep iterating over it. So there's find, we got to make sure we do our find close. Excuse me. It's the one problem with drinking seltzer while you're on live stream. So find next file will give us the next file that will populate this find data. So that's our find handle, and that's going to have our find data. If the function succeeds, the return is non-zero, and the parameter contains information. If the function fails, the return is 0. So we say while this, we'll just print out the content just so we can see what we got here. Right, so find file data. Do wprintf again because of Microsoft's fun stuff here. So let's get rid of this. I thought I took this out of all of the project. It's the precompiled headers. We don't want that right now or ever, probably. Where am I missing? I'm missing semicolon. Okay, so then the other thing is we want to, in here, have an external function, platform initialize, and in here, we're going to call load current home. In the actual tool startup, we run platform initialize. Let's do that after we have a window. So the idea is that platform initialize gets called when we start up, and each platform we implement will implement these functions to do the work and populate the application with the data that's necessary. So let's see. So we do want a function to handle getting the content from this call. So let's build that. So void, and we'll call handle what do they call this? Load current home. Handle current home. Didn't spell that right. And it takes a file system item list items and unsigned int item count, right? And then I guess again you have to spell it right. And we're not going to do anything right now with this because that's not necessary. It's going to be I just wanted to, actually, we'll just make sure that it gets called here. But we'll need that for populating the list view that we're going to have to create in here. All right, so, all right, cool. So you can see that it listed out these files, which are in, if we go to the projects folder, it listed out all the files. And there's a separate call to get folders, but I'm okay with what we have here now because we only want files to start out with. Obviously, it's not populating anything yet, but the point is that it got called. The other thing we need to do is, what do they call that? System hooks. Current home equals handle current home. Right, so we set our function pointer here. What did I do wrong? File system item items unsigned int count. Can I convert to current home? Is this because, why? Because of the calling convention? What's the issue? Cannot be assigned to an entity type, current home. This wasn't a problem with the other stuff we were doing, so... Oh, because it's an int and not an unsigned int. Well, it should be. We don't want negative items, right? Okay. So we got our printf here. So that's good. We're getting stuff that we expected to get called is actually getting called. So that is excellent. So now we want to actually build the list of the file system items that we are going to be passing to the application on startup. So what we want to do is, instead of making this null, we want to allocate some number of items right, so basically the reason I'm doing this is I want to allocate a fixed size of a fixed amount of memory for this potential list of items. Right, we're zeroing it out. And the idea is that we have up to 20. If we need more, we can reallocate. We can probably do more than that, you know, say 100 maybe. And then I'm being stupid because I didn't actually use the variable, which is the whole point of it existing instead of hard coding 20. So that was not helpful. I just want to check one other thing. We're going to skip, well, there are two things here, right? So we've got the first file that comes back when this is called, but I expect that that's going to be dot, which is, you know, the home, like if you do cd dot and it brings you to right back to the folder you're in, and there's the dot dot, which is the parent relative file path reference. If we go back, you can see. Well, why don't we set a breakpoint and actually look at the data? So if we set a breakpoint here and look at this, you can see that in this, the file name is period, which we don't really want to see that because we're not trying to manipulate that or allow for traversing the file system that way. Nonetheless, let's do this. Let's change this up a little bit so that we can make this work the way we want. I'm probably going to change that, but just bear with me a second here. So I'm just going to turn down my mic a little bit here. Does the handle doesn't become null? Let's do this. Let's find handle. All right, so we have the handle. If the handle is null, then we shouldn't be going into there anyway. And then we want to actually take this and let's see. So find next file. If not find next file, break. Right, that should produce the same result as before, slightly different way. Only because I want to examine, yeah, the first item. Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted by the puppy upstairs. All right, so what we want to do now is say current content, number of items, name. Oh, you know what? There's a problem though with us calling it this way. I don't care about the wide string name right now. We're not doing anything with that, and I don't know that this library actually even supports like UTF-8 or multi-byte characters. So I want to call the standard call to this, the non-wide character call to this. And what is the problem with this one? Is this a different structure? It is a different structure. So in Windows, they have these essentially these different definitions that map to the sort of the Unicode and the non-Unicode versions of functions, where the non-Unicode ones are they have the letter A at the end of the name, and then the Unicode ones have the W. Since we're not since the Tiger library doesn't support Unicode to my knowledge, and maybe it does, and we'll fix that later, but we need to add the A to the end so that we're actually getting non-Unicode names from the file system. What is the problem with this? Oh yeah, that's complaining about this. So what was the version of string copy that we used in the previous? String and copy S. All right. So we want to copy it into here, and the source is define file data. Now we need to give it the destination size. Or is it just the count? It's just the count at the end. Okay, never mind. Sorry. Find file data. File name. That's the buffer size. Why is it giving a different definition here? Is it because I don't have string.h? So it should be this, and then the max file size, the max name size. Oh no, we just do truncate. Right, I don't know why I'm having a hard time with this one. Size in bytes for the destination, the source, the max count. Okay, yeah. So let's step into this, make sure we're actually doing this correctly. File size high and low, so they divided up. I'm just going to go with the file size low because, again, we don't really care about anything that big. You know, normally you'd use the high and low size to get the full size of the file, but if we go to the definition of the find data, you'll see that it says that the file size high and low, it's two 32-bit. They're the D words, and so it's the, where's the, you have the high order byte, and you also have the low order byte, sorry, D word, I should say, of the file size. And so you can use, they have this definition here where you can calculate what the actual total size of the file is. Again, I'm going to just stick with the low order byte, D word rather. So if we now take a look at what we have in our current content, so we have the period. Let me add a quick filter here that we don't care about that. So if string compare, it's going to yell at me for using that to file data. Well, actually, let's just do this. We could say if the first byte in the name is a period, then we don't care about it. We're going to ignore it. I mean, theoretically, we could say they're hidden, since in a Unix file system, that would be considered hidden. I don't know. I'm just justifying using a lazy way of determining if we should ignore the file, basically. And then the other thing we forgot to do is all right. So let's. So what happened? Did I break it? Oh, yeah, well, dummy. That should be a continue, not a break. What are you doing? doing here? Visual Studio. Oh, well, yeah. I'm just batting 1,000 here. Let's do this. Let's skip over the part where we actually populate the structure because we have to call find next file. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in an infinite loop like we were. All right, let's try that again. There we go. We didn't get stuck in an infinite loop. Nice. So, current content 0. Okay, what did it actually find the file data? Oh, right, it hasn't actually stored anything yet. We want to, okay. I was still thinking about the way it was working before. All right, cool. So we have our file name, which is assettoolhooks.h. We're going to copy that over. It's not a directory, and the file size is 475 bytes. And if I go to the folder and we actually look at the properties of the file, it is 475 bytes. Okay. So that's good. That's what I wanted to see. So if we just exit out of here, at this point, number of items is 9. If we look at the folder, we have 9 items. Although one of them is a folder. Was it including the folder all along and I just missed it when I was talking about it? Current content 8. Win32. This shouldn't be anything. It isn't. 7. Number of items. Oh, okay. The number of items is going to be 1 too many because of the fact that it's incrementing it out of the after it's done here. Let's do this. Okay. So, number of items. That would be why is it showing? Oh, for crying out loud. Making this more difficult for myself than I need to. I'm just going to subtract 1 here. Right, number of items is 8. There are 8 files, not including the folder. So we'll close our find. We have a current home. We call it. We're in here. If we look at the items, that looks good. It is picking up the directory. That okay. So that's strange. If it's picking up the directory, then it is supposed to be 9 items. For some reason, I thought the directory was excluded. But again, it's been a little while since I've done this, so let me double check that. That's strange that that's being returned. search as a directory for or subdirectory. Oh, it does. Okay. So how do we determine that it's a directory versus a file? File or directory found. If you're running through, lists all the files in a directory in the application may run this for a bit. I don't care about that right now. I guess we have to look and see if it is just a directory. Is there, I mean, there's a way. Oh, okay, there is a file attribute. Okay. So I want to skip this. If it's a folder, let's do that. Or find file data.c file, DW file attributes, and file attribute directory. It doesn't equal 0. Right, so we're just should just be a bit, and if it's not set, we're going to get 0, which means it's a file, or at least not a directory, and that's what we want. So let's go back and take a look. Now we're getting 10 items. No. Bad programmer. Sorry. I think I give up for tonight. File name doesn't end. File attribute directory. You ever just have one of those days? That's what today is. Today is one of those days. So there are 8 things selected here. It's saying the number of items is 7. And that's because I'm continuing my trend of stupidity for the evening and subtracting 1, and I don't need to be, because it only increments when you actually get something, starting with the 0th element. All right, so number of items is 8, and then if we go into this call, obviously the 8th item is going to be empty. I just wanted to verify that. That's good. And win32cpp is the last file in the directory. Excellent. Okay. Well, that was unnecessarily complicated. All right. So through my own making, of course. Now we have our list. So what I want to do is I want to actually current file list. So this is potentially not potentially. This is not exactly the greatest way to do this. I mean, specifically, it's not problematic the way we're doing it right now, because when we call the initialize, we're not doing anything where we would be looking at this file system list while it was being updated. But we do have some provisions in here for us to close that. I don't need that. Some provisions in here to get notifications when a file changes or a folder changes. And the problem with that is that those are going to be asynchronous type operations. They're going to be essentially multi-threaded, which means that if we're manipulating this list while it's being accessed by this while loop, that's going to be a problem. So we're going to have to deal with some synchronization stuff. Again, the way it is right now, there's no issue per se, but let me make a little note here. So it's not thread safe. That's fine for now. We just want to get this kind of working and in decent order here. So now we can start to actually build the interface for this, and of course we don't have that control that we would want, which would be a list, right? And similar to the frame, it's going to be essentially something that creates a context, right? It's going to be a container that the other items get added to. In this case, list items. So we would do a list item for every file that we got back from this call here. And we would say, you know, we need to put it somewhere. We need to say how, what the width and the height are. Let's say just 100 by 100. And we don't need to give it a name yet. I think that's a good enough starting point, because we can add complexity to it as we need to. So let's start that. One thing we didn't do in the last stream is we had a to-do here. Again, this is not a real stack, and this is going to be a problem if we want to push multiple contexts, but for what we're doing right now, we're okay. So let's do that here. We may end up separating these GUI controls into their own separate files to kind of keep it a little bit more organized, but for now, I think it's okay. Oh, that's what I forgot. That's why it had one extra parameter. We'll call this 1. And we'll say it's at 10, 10, 100, 100. Just for the sake of simplicity right now, we don't know what it's going to look like exactly. There is no text. So similarly to what we were doing before, we're going to look for this list in the current context that we're operating in to see if it exists already or not. One thing we need to do is we still need to push this context regardless of whether it's created or not. So that was a bug. All right, so if we didn't find the node, we want to initialize a new control node. Background color can be white, XY width, height. There is no text for this. The control type is list, because we got that. That's good. And let me just see what we got here. So remember how we set all this up. So padding, renderer, right, and then push our context node, and then obviously we don't have a RenderList function yet, so let's create that. So I'm just going to do so the list is going to be interesting because we So lists normally work. I mean, you can see them here. They're, you know, that they have some sort of list of items in them, and depending on the size of the list, it has to know if the items fit, and if not, create a ScrollBar. Not that we necessarily need to deal with that now, but I wonder. What I'm thinking we're going to have to do for the list is likely do something where we say check children heights to see if they exceed the current height of the list, and if so, create a ScrollBar. And then part of it would be cached in the ScrollData for this control, you know, provided that it doesn't get destroyed because it's no longer in use, is vertical scroll position, horizontal scroll position, vertical. I'm just going to say V scroll and H scroll. V scroll max, H scroll max. Right, and then we need to add ScrollData to our union here. Not that we're going to be doing anything with the scrolling right now. I just want to get the items in the list. Now the other interesting thing is that lists have the ability to be single select and multi-select. When they're single select, you need to be able to ensure that the other items aren't selected, and I feel like that's something that the parent handles. So it's almost as if what we're going to have to do for this is not the frame. Where's the list? We're going to have to look at the mouse to see if it's been clicked. And if it's been clicked, determine based on the height of the list items that are children of this list, which one was clicked. So we may have to do that traversal no matter what, even if we're not going to do the scroll bar, just so we can actually select items. So traverse children to see which one was clicked, if any. Well, that's going to be tricky to do on. So we wouldn't want to do that in the beginning. We actually want to do that. Yeah, we actually have to do that at the end. Both of those things, because at the beginning, we don't know. I mean, I guess we do the second time around. The first time around, though, before we've cached any of these things in our control tree, we don't know how many items are going to be in that list. And so we actually can't determine which list item is selected until we've got all of them in the list, and then from there we can tell the list item that it is selected. So when it renders, it'll render as a selected list item, right? So sorry, I'm kind of like thinking this out loud and not explaining it maybe as clearly as I should. So if you have a list, it's got some items in it. When we're doing our build-up of the user interface, we're saying, okay, first I've got this list, which is my new context for the controls that I'm going to be placing, and here are my list items that are going to be within it. While the user is looking at the user interface, they might want to click on this item. Well, at the beginning of describing the GUI in the code, we don't know how many items are in here. So we can't determine what's selected or not. We actually have to do it after the items are already placed into that structure where we have the tree and then we have all the items as nodes, right? And then we use the height of the items to determine which one was selected based on the mouse position and the offset from the top of the list. That's not super hard to do, just a little tedious, and also just I don't think we're gonna get to, unfortunately, the NES stuff, which is what I really wanted to do, but it just always takes a little bit longer than I anticipated. Well, anyway, so let's start with this, and then let's add. We're going to have to define what kind of selection type we support. And that's just an enum. It's better. I should have I think it's better to say list selection type rather than just selection type. What am I? Oh, I'm missing the scroll data here. Saw that error go by in the peripheral vision. We may have other selection types that we want to allow for that have nothing to do with lists. Okay, so that's our selection type. And okay. Now we do our mouse checks, right? So we say tiger mouse, current context. No. Well, do we want it? No, you have to do it on the screen. In window, X, Y, oops, MX, MY, MB. So if MB 1, meaning the left mouse button is clicked, we want to, we don't want to bother traversing the children if there are if there's no mouse button click. So the good thing is I don't think we have to do this recursively. I think we can just traverse the current context's children. Because we're, I mean, if you wanted to allow a list within a list, you could have to do that recursively. I don't want to. I don't think we're going to need that. I think that would be a little nuts, but we could if we wanted to. If the child is a valid child, so what we need to do is we need to actually define wait, did I call that ScrollData? That's not what it is. It is list data. I mean, it has ScrollData in it, but it is not specifically ScrollData. All right. Okay. And just have that for now, right? That it's selected. Probably should check to make sure it's a list item in case we end up doing something where we are adding a non-list item to the list for some reason. I'm not sure what we would be doing, but it's better to check just to make sure. Just list, right? List item. We have to define that. So if the control type is list item, then, oh, let's see. So this gets back into, well, I guess this we wouldn't care about the X and Y value of, we wouldn't care about the X and Y value of the list item. We don't necessarily want to pass that in when we create it because we want the list to control the height of the items that are going into it. So that would be another field potentially. Say item height, let's say 20 pixels. We'll give it a default value. And that can be yet another piece of information we need to store. Right, so if all of our items are 20 pixels fixed, we could potentially allow that to be overridden at some point so that list items could have variable sizes, but let's start with a simple case where they're going to be fixed size. Then we shouldn't have gaps in the child list. So what we want to do is we just want to check to make sure that so we want to make sure the mouse falls within within the list item entry position in the list itself. But of course this means that the list items, when they get rendered, are they rendered by the list itself? Which then breaks our tree structure. I guess not. I think it would be that the the list would have to so basically what has to happen is the list has to position update the children with the appropriate X and Y coordinate and width and height based on its settings, so that when it's rendered, it just renders correctly based on what the parent list control itself has determined based on its own size. See, these are the things you don't think about when you're using a user interface. These are pretty complex things, and we're just dealing with a simple list of single items. There's a lot that goes into something like being able to do resizable lists, and I don't know that we'll ever actually try to support that in our interface, but for now, let's just make this part work. So the child X is equal to current context X, right? Now the Y is the current context Y plus I times list data. Where's list? That's a list item data. Did I accidentally? Oh, I never renamed this part. List data. Okay. I times current context list data item height. Right. So we're just saying, okay, the height times the number of items, add that to the Y, and we're good. As long as we don't have any gaps in the children, which we shouldn't. We will be okay. I realize this is not a perfect solution. We could probably add a separate counter that would handle the item count so that it's independent of the loop counter, but for now it's okay. We can add a to-do on that. Make the Y calculation independent of the loop counter so that we are not concerned with the children in the list. You never know, you might end up with a deactivated child that goes away, and then like if we get a change where a file is deleted from the file system, right? You get a notification that the file was deleted because the user goes into the folder in Explorer and actually deletes it, or in Finder if it's Mac OS, and then you get and then you'd have a gap in the list of controls, and then that would not work. But that's not a problem right now since we're not dealing with the file system changes yet. So we want to make sure that it's a list item. Oh wait, we're not done yet. So the width should be the current context's width, which presumably could change as we resize the window. For now, obviously that's not happening. The height is the list data item height. And then what we want to do is we want to say, okay, if mx is greater than child x and mx is less than child x plus child width. Let's get these wrapped in some parentheses just for my sanity, if for no other reason, because I get super paranoid when I don't have parentheses around things, not because I don't know the order of operations, but just because it makes it more obvious for me. So my is greater than child y, and my is less than child y plus child height. Nope, that's not right. It's, oh yeah, the child height, not the parent height. So we know the button is pressed, and then so we say child selected list item data selected equals true. So that was selected. I guess we could even short circuit this. We could say if current context list data select type equals single. Oops, single. We'll just break. Right. So basically, if it's a single selection list, we don't have to bother checking anymore. If it were multi-select, in addition to checking if it was a multi-select, we would also want to check to see if like the shift key is held down, and if the shift key wasn't held down, you know, the shift key would do multiple selections between the two selected items in the list, and it gets into all sorts of complications that we're not going to tackle right now. Handle shift and control pressed for selection for multiple selections. So we'll just break out there. So if it's selected, it'll render slightly different, right? It'll render it with the blue selection versus the or a background color with white text versus just white background and black text. That all seems okay from me talking it out. We'll see. I'm sure there's something I missed here. We obviously need to add the ability to render a list item now that we're trying to deal with them. And then we additionally need to create something called list item, where it does not have a XY, width, height, anything like that passed in, because it's going to be determined by the list itself, but it does need an ID. I think separately we probably want to have a list item ID, because independent of the user interface ID itself, the list might need to identify the item, and if it's a string, you don't want to rely on the string necessarily. Although we can make this optional. We can make that optional. So let's just do this. That's the text, and then list ID. And just optionally will be set to 0. So this is essentially a lot of the same stuff here. So yeah, we've got that, and then we are going to pass this to be 0 because we don't know any of that stuff. It's the parent list that's going to set that. We have the padding, we have render list item, we have that's not relevant anymore. List item data selected false, right? Because we don't know if it's selected or not. What is this complaining about? List item begin does not take. Right, so we need to say this is a single select list. Oh, that should be GUI single. Yeah, you know, I don't like the way that looks out of context. It's potentially confusing. List single selection. List multiple selection. Yeah, so at least this way it's obvious that it's single for that. I mean, we could probably reuse that at some point, the single selection, the selection mode, but I feel like it's potentially different enough that we want to have it distinct for lists. I don't know. We'll see as we go. All right, so we've got that render list. So render the list is pretty straightforward. We're going to fill the background. Right, with the background color. We don't have the ability to set a foreground color yet, so it's going to just default to a black frame. So, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, and then for rendering the list item, it's basically going to be the same thing as if we look at our button rendering. Or actually, maybe it's closer to our label rendering. So let's do this. Let's steal this code. Let's steal this code and where is the frame? That's the frame. Where's the list item? There it is. So the reason I'm going to steal this code is because it's essentially doing a lot of what I want to do for a lot of what I want to do for the list item. So we don't care about button width and height because the list actually controls the width and height, and I should so the width should actually be plus double the padding plus oops, padding right, because we want padding on all around the whole thing. And so that adjusts the width properly. So what I want is the text width and height, which means that the list item also needs a text width and height. So we can center it. All right, so list item. That's the render. Render list item. Okay, so that width and height go into the list item data. Well, at least it's compiling. I guess the padding is really irrelevant here because it's really the padding of the parent that matters, right? So what we would want to do is we would want to set it to doing that. All right, so that's going to set the padding properly. We need to copy the text. Which is part of, okay. I'm gonna add that. So that's set, that's that looks reasonable. So when we go to render the list item, we are going to first do our fill on the layer with the nodes X, Y. width, height, and do we need to do? We do need to do the background, but we want to change the background to realistically be the background color of the parent, whatever that might be. Assuming that the child, you know, allows for transparency, something we might mess with later, where it could be that the child has different colors in the background. But just for the sake of expediency and trying to get this part done so we can actually see a file list soon, let's just assume that it's going to be whatever the parent's background color is, unless, of course, it's selected. If it's selected, then there's a selection color that it should be using. We're gonna say that color is blue, just because I don't need to do that. Fill color is equal to blue. T-pixel. Obviously don't have blue defined here. Super dark blue, render list item. So layer, and then fill color, and we also need another one here for text color. Gray, and then if it's selected, then the text color has to become white so that it stands out on the dark background. Take a rectangle, node X, node Y, node width, node height, fill color. Nope, it should be black. And then we want to render the text. And that takes the layer, T-font. So node X plus node padding, node Y plus node padding. The color. And then, of course, the text itself. All right. So who knows if any of that actually even works in the way that I expect it to, but we're about to find out. So GUI list item. My unlikely success. Yeah, why not? And why? So let's see what we actually get. We get a crash. No, we get a breakpoint. All right. So that's not terrible. It rendered it outside of the scope of our window, our scroll, our list rather. But it didn't crash. So something is wrong in the way that it's calculating this. So what's wrong? Oh, is it already popping it off the... No, it didn't pop the context. So let's take a look at what we're actually doing here. Oh, it's not even calling that. Oh, because of the... Oh, you... All right, so this was just stupidity on my part here. The problem is that it wasn't even bothering to do this stuff where it was calculating the sizes unless the mouse was pressed, which originally was okay, that it was doing these checks conditionally, but because we're now modifying the child every time we go through with the appropriate X, Y, width, and height and stuff like that, the mouse press is actually irrelevant until the point at which we want to check to see if it's a list item that we need to mark as selected. So that was why it was totally wrong. Let's see if that's better. Yeah. Okay, so that's actually going into this now. All right, so that's something. So why is it not rendering that the right way? So render list item, list begin, render it list. So let's take a look at what we're doing. So for the list, we're doing a rectangle fill, and then we're doing the rectangle. For list begin, we're pushing the context of that list. And then we should be, when we're adding the list item, we should be adding that to the current context, which would be the list itself. So the current context is, let's see, it's a list. Okay, so that part is right. Let's go to this for a second here. So the current context is still the list, hopefully it is. And so we have the child with no X and Y coordinate setting. So now we've changed it to the X and Y of the list. We've given it the width and height. And we have a padding and a background, and the button isn't pressed, so that's it. So let's think about that for a second. So that would mean that in our tree, what we should have is oops, that's not what I wanted. What we should have is we should have our background, we should have our list, and then we should have our item. And potentially there are more items, but if we go to what is the root node called? Tree root. We have our background, and it has a child, which is our list, which should have a child, which is our list item. And it does. So that tree is all good. So when it traverses that, it should first render our background color. Then should call this, it should render the list box on top of that, right? And then it should call this, which should render the list item within that list. So I think what I want to do is I want to disable the list item rendering just for a moment to see what the list itself is looking like. Let me make that, well, okay, that's fine. That's what that should have looked like. No surprises there. Let me disable rendering the list now and see if the item, okay, so that's not right. That might be wrong for a couple of reasons. That might be wrong because the height is not big enough. Let's make the default text height something bigger. I mean, that's going to be font dependent, but I want to choose something that makes sense. Am I modifying a value that's having no impact on anything? It's having no impact. Why? Why is that having no impact? Because list item, list data, item height not being set anywhere. That is not helpful. Let's try that again. Okay, so that is now actually setting something. The text that I chose, of course, is a little bit too long, but that's okay. Now what I want to see is if we add the list back, if we actually get an item in the list. So the list is drawing over. Well, so interesting. The cool thing is that when I clicked it, actually you can see it change the background color to make it selected. Let's just do a simple check here. Which is being called first, the item or the list? The list, then the item, and then the item, and then the list. Okay. So it's weird that that would be. Am I messing this up? So it's adding the control node here, it's adding the control node here to the current context. It's pushing the context. Which is just swapping current context and putting it into a temporary. Like we said, this is totally bogus, but that should be okay for one layer. On the list end, we're popping the context once we're done here. Let's do a couple loops through and see if the tree is getting mangled somehow. So that's one time through, and we had kind of seen that that looks reasonable from what I recall. So that's the background. There's a first child, which is our list. There's a child underneath that, which is our list item. So that's all good. If we loop through again, we have, let's see, let's do this. So tree root, children 0, that's our list, and that's got nothing. So that's what I would expect to see. So why is that rendering backwards? The list item is a child of the, I mean, like, by that logic, if I do, and we can do it right over, that should be visible over the list, right? And it is. So that button is rendering the way that I expected the list item to render. For some reason, the list item is behind the list. What am I doing wrong here? Render list item. We got our stuff there. We're adding our control to the current context. If we go to the call to end, let's take a look at this, right? So the first time through, we're going to get the background, which is going to render the background, right? And that's fine. that's render background. That's good. So now we're going to go in and we're going to look at all the children. And so now this node coming in, this is going to call RenderList. That's good. And then the first child in here is our list item. That's going to render. That's going to call end on the item, right? And that's going to draw that, and then that's the layer. That's the child. It's got no children here, so when we step in, that should be null, which means we're going to return, and we do, and it should just keep doing that until we run out of children to do that for. Child renderer. Oh. Why am I doing that multiple times? That's not right. Okay. So the problem is I'm calling this renderer here, which it shouldn't be calling the renderer there because it gets called by the call to end. So if it calls end on the child gets rendered, and then after it's done, if it was successful, it goes, let's see, what does it do? It checks if the child, right, so if the child wasn't null, we look to see if the child is active. Well, why would it be rendered if it wasn't active? It wouldn't be. Which would mean that we wouldn't ever actually prune the tree. Did I somehow break this in one of the changes I made? That's strange that it's doing this. What it should really be doing is it should be saying, okay, if the child isn't active, then prune the tree at that child. I think maybe when I change the way that that handles the active flag in the child, it broke this. So if it's not active, meaning we didn't actually look for the node to place it in the tree, then we're going to prune that child and all of its children and continue on to the next child. Otherwise, we're going to call end to the child, which will render it and then try to render all its children accordingly, and then we'll set it to false if we get a non-zero return, which would have meant that node was not zero. Node was not null. All right, so what? Oh, right. So that breaks that check. Oh, I see. So that was kind of a stupid way of doing this. In meaning the way that I originally done this, I think was the reason it was structured the other way before I just changed it was because we were expecting to have end return non-zero values always. I don't know. It's just not. It wasn't the right way to do it. So if child and not child active, otherwise. So let's. Okay, I know what to do. This is a better way to do it because this is going to be handling it recursively, a little more concisely. So what we're going to do is Oh, but then the parent. Okay. All right. I know what to do. Sorry. These are the things you get into when you deal with trees. So if node is not active, so it's not null, but it's not active either. So we want to prune the node from the tree. And then we want to return a value that will tell us, hey, we got a node that was not active. So if, so we'll say, we'll get our return code if RC equals 1, else if RC equals 2, we want to prune that node. Node children I equals null. So it's already been deleted by prune tree. We just need to set it to null here, and we get 2 when it's not active and we've pruned it. I'm not sure that this is the most concise way to do it, but that handles, I think, the conditions. Yes, okay. So the only thing I'm not doing correctly now is the width of the list is not taking into account the padding of the list item that I introduced. So let's see, list end. So the padding would be inclusive of the width, is essentially what we really want. So I don't actually need to add it here. Same thing with the height. Yeah, so that'll be inclusive, so that whatever the width and the height is of the list, it will get included. So, or it'll be incorporated properly. Let's make the list wider. We're not doing any sort of what's the word? Clipping of the contents of the list item, which is fine for now. We'll just make it wider until it fits, and then we'll figure out why my list item height is wrong. I am changing the wrong damn thing. That's the height. I think it's time to potentially end the stream, despite the fact that we didn't get to what I wanted to get to. All right. So what is up with the list item height now? So the list item height is the X. Let's see. So it's X plus padding. Rectangle is the width and the height. The width and the height. So that should be correct. Oh, it's not incorporating into it the text width and height. Right. But the item height should be sufficient based on the way that we're modeling this. We're saying that the item height is what controls the height of the item in the list, not the height of the text. So it is a fixed height regardless of text size. And so now let's make this a little bit less silly and actually go through our list of files. We'll say GUI list item. The ID. Let's just say T plus I, because I don't have a better system right now than that. Current file list I name. Okay, cool. So we actually have all of our items, and then I should be able to select. Okay, well that's cool. So it's not deselecting, but that's okay. That's easy to fix. We just say list item. Let's render list item here. So all we do is when we get the node, we say list item data selected false, right? Because we don't know if it's selected. Oh, actually, we do know if it's selected. It's whether or not the selection has changed. So let's do this. What we need to do is we need to. So we can't actually exit out of this because we need to. Well, we can do this. We can say list item data selected false. We're going to assume that it's not selected until we verify that it is selected. The button was pressed on it. Well, we want the selection to be persistent. Blah. This is yucky. So all we know is the button is pressed. Well, no. Okay, no, this is fine because if the button is pressed and we want to check actually before we do this, we want to check is the mouse even in the context of the list, right? We want to say is it within the list? What did I mess up in my syntax here? Right, so if we are within the context of, although we don't need to check that every time. So right, if we only care if the mouse is pressed, then we're in the context of the list, and if we're in the context of the list, then what we want to do is we want to, at that point, yeah, so we're going to say in click within list equals false. Click within list equals true. So we're going to say, okay, so if MB and 1, meaning the mouse button is pressed, and we've clicked within the list, then at that point we want to deactivate the list item and activate the one that was actually clicked on. Now this is going to have the side effect of when you click in the list and there is nothing in the list area, it's going to deselect. It's going to deselect. Oh, so that's interesting. Is it because these list items are actually bigger than the list, potentially? With just the number of them? What I was going to say is that it would have the effect of if we have enough items, yeah, so like if I click here, it's going to deselect. That's interesting. So why? Oh, because I'm breaking out of, right. So we don't actually have to check anything. We just want to force deselect everything else. Force deselect equals true, and then continue. Or actually, just say right. So at that point, basically any other items that we're encountering, because we're in list single selection, we're just forcefully deselecting it. So we're just saying, okay, at this point, we've changed the selection to false, and we don't care about anything else. We're not doing anything. Probably helps to do this after we've verified. So we say it's false, and then we say we're done. We don't care if it's within. We know it's not. We know it's not within because the force deselect is true, which means that it's already been selected for a single item, and it's a single selection. So there we go. Now we got a list that we can select things in. That's not half bad. All right. There's obviously a lot there that's missing. Like I said, the scrolling and the clipping, and that just, these things seem to take longer than I expect, partially because I'm building them and figuring it out as we go. So now that we have that, we probably want to know what the selected item is, right? And for that, I think list n probably would be what would return what's selected. And what it's going to be returning is it's going to be returning the list ID. So whatever our selected list ID is, or the list item ID, I guess it really is. But so this is a separate. Oops. This is a separate ID for the list item that you would use to identify the selected item specifically. So in the end, we would want to say, and we want it to be an int because I want it to be that if nothing is selected, it's going to return -1. Int selected ID equals -1. If it's multiple selection, not sure how we'll handle that. I'm not sure that we're going to handle that, but we'll deal with that later. So, or maybe it'll just return the last item that was selected, so that it will. You'll at least have that, and then if you want to get the multiple selections, you've got to iterate over the entire list to see what's selected. I'm pretty sure I've seen that in. Well, that's not really good design as far as immediate mode GUIs go, I guess. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look at that one and see what makes the most sense there, as far as how other immediate mode GUIs handle that. Alright, so at least we're getting a selected ID now, and then we want to change this to actually provide a selected ID, and then it doesn't equal, well, we gotta actually set it to a value. this should be RC. So now we should get something. Are we not returning the right thing? Oh, you know what? We're not actually setting the ID of the list item that's coming in because it didn't matter before. List ID, node, list item data, ID equals list ID. Okay, now we should actually see the right selections. We do. The other problem, obviously, somewhat is that it is not only selecting it once, it's selecting it as we hold the button down. But, you know, we've come this far. It's kind of cool that that's working. I wish we had made more progress so that I could actually export something to the NES. Where are we at? We're at 11:06. Anybody got any questions related to what we've covered so far? I think what I want to do for the next stream on Monday, I'm gonna just because this is taking up so much time, unless people object, I'm going to work on the GUI stuff on my own a little bit, just because it's again, it's not really relevant necessarily to the NES. It's interesting, certainly, but I feel like if we're going to rely on this being something that I do on stream only, it's going to be a few more streams before we get to a point where I'm able to get back to the NES code. Because what I'd like to be able to do is, now that we have that list working, I want to fix the way the text is aligned. I want to be able to do clipping. I want to be able to do a right-click context menu for something like export to NES. I want to be able to. I mean, the part that would be easy is like you click on this CPP file and it would show, you know, some sort of text window here where you could see the content. You know, we've got that basically working, right? It's got the selected item there as one of the things that's coming back from when startup occurs. We need to handle file system changes. So if I go to this folder right now and I create a new file like this, right? Obviously nothing happens here until we restart. I want that to be a process that happens automatically so that it just adds that to the list while we're working, sort of similar to how something like Sublime Text does that. So there's a lot still to do. I think, you know, maybe I can work on the GUI elements and then come back to you guys on Monday and have the GUI stuff basically working, and we can start talking about actually exporting stuff for the NES, so images, etc. Let me know in the comments on the recording, or let me know in the chat before I wrap up. Yeah, this stuff is interesting. It's just kind of really taking a lot longer than I was expecting it to. Foolishly optimistic as most programmers are. It's like, oh, it's a user interface. How hard could that be? Apparently very hard. Or at least very time-consuming. It hasn't been hard. It's just been a time-consuming endeavor. All right. Well, I don't see any comments, but like I said, if you want to catch up with me, you can comment on the video, the recording on YouTube. You can also message me on Twitter at Clairvis. You can also find me on the Discord for Nintendo Age. And I will see you Monday. Have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you later.